You may know me as N, which is a nickname I was going by for a little while, but my name is Eyan. My pronouns are he, him, and I work in the Adult and Teen Services Department here at Fountaindale. And I'm going to talk to you today about a subject of book that is very important to me personally. So we're going to have a little bit of anecdote and be a little more personal than I typically am, but these are some of my favorite books and my favorite genre. So if you have never met me or don't know anything about me, I am a medieval scholar. I had gone to college originally to do a library science master's degree and then got very distracted by medieval studies and medieval literature, and King Arthur in particular. So I have just finished writing, and I'm editing and about to turn in, and hopefully by the time this posts I have turned in my master's thesis for my master's in Arthurian literature. And what I have been working with is the Mor The Arthur by Sir Thomas Mallory. It's from the 15th century, and it is very long, and it is in Middle English, and I just wrote a very long paper about it. Now this is my copy, which I brought just to illustrate how sacrilegious I am with my books as a literature major, because I write all over them and I highlight and I sticky note, and do not do that to library books. It took me years to learn how to properly read like this, where you're doing your note-taking, because I grew up in libraries and it just feels so wrong. But I would not have completed literature degrees without being able to do that. We don't have a copy of this exact text at the library. It is in Middle English, which is very similar to modern English, but it is not the same language. It's a lot more French. And while most of it would probably make sense, it's not something that the casual reader typically can enjoy, because it takes a lot more effort to kind of work through what each word means. For Middle English, think Chaucer, that's Middle English, whereas Shakespeare is actually kind of the beginning of modern English. We still pronounced vowels differently in Shakespeare's time, but the language was the same. What you can get through our Pinnacle library system is Peter Ackroyd wrote a modern translation of this book, and that is very good. And there is a copy within our system, so you can definitely get to that even though it's not housed here. And I do recommend it, because what Thomas Mallory did was he took all these hundreds of years of literary tradition about Arthur and Lancelot and Tristan and put it in kind of one story. I particularly focus on the Tristan and Lancelot relationship with each other, and I'm really interested in medieval masculinity. But King Arthur has always spoken to me, and King Arthur has remained a popular story that everybody likes to read about. King Arthur is responsible for Excalibur, even though that wasn't always part of his myth. Like, you know, the Sword and the Stone, and the Knights of the Round Table, the Holy Grail, these are all King Arthur. And the fact that modern readers are still so interested in Arthur and in the medieval, I think really speaks to the style of story that we have always told as humans, and as people who like to read stories about knights and heroes and questing and adventure. It's still very recognizable in modern English. So I'm going to talk about some of my favorites today that kind of range a genre gauntlet, and I'm going to try to stick fairly modern, although I've got a couple that are a little less so, starting with what brought me into King Arthur in the first place. So Alfred Lord Tennyson was a 19th century poet, Queen Victoria's England, and Victoria's husband, King Albert, the king consort, was very interested in Arthur. So the 19th century had a big revival of King Arthur and of medievalism and of being very interested in these things. And Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was a poet laureate, wrote a lot of poetry with those themes. But in particular, the poem The Lady of Shalott from 1832, which is about a woman who is stuck in a tower because she knows if she leaves the tower or even looks out the window, she will die. But she looks in the reflection of her mirror every day, and she sees beautiful Lancelot being a knight, and she gets to a point where she decides she would rather die by having a chance to live than stay in her tower forever. And it begins On either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye, that clothe the world and meet the sky, and through the field the road runs by to many-towered Camelot. And I just have always loved it, even though I'm not a huge poetry fan, because Anne of Green Gables was obsessed with that particular poem, and as a child I watched that miniseries from the late 80s all the time. So that was my first exposure, was, a 19th century poet. And I will say that we have the major works of Tennyson here, and he's got a lot of good poetry that kind of has similar feels. So you've got The Lady of Shalott, but what he is most known for is I always say this wrong, Memoriam, which he wrote for his deceased best friend, wherein he imagined that late friend was King Arthur. And that is a beautiful poem of love and of loss, and really is kind of what made his fame. So if you like poetry and you can handle 19th century romantic writing, and I say romantic as the genre, not like necessarily that it's like romance like modern romance, then it's definitely worth a shot to read. And even if you just read a couple of them, I haven't read all of his poems because I am not a poet, a scholar of poetry, but it's definitely worth it. And he's got a version of the Mor The Arthur, and just it's worthwhile just to kind of know about the Arthurian revival in the 19th century. And then a little bit more modern, J.R.R. Tolkien of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings fame was a medieval scholar. He was most known for speaking the Norse languages, and he kind of brought back medieval study as a respected field in England. And so The Fall of Arthur, he never finished while he was living. It was edited and finished by his son afterwards, but it tells the ending of the Mor To Arthur, of Arthur's death, the battle with Mordred, his illegitimate bastard son with his sister in a lot of versions, and there's a lot that goes on there, but it's sad because the way that Arthur's story is always told is that he's this wonderful man and his death was sad. So the fall of Arthur, the fall of the Round Table, the loss of chivalry really comes through in this poem, even though it's unfinished as Tolkien wrote it himself. But I love this version. It is a fantastic version and definitely more on the scholarly side. But if that's what you're interested in and if you like Tennyson, I would go to Tolkien next. But if that's not your style, I have a very modern indeed collection of short stories called Sword, Stone, Table. And what this is actually an anthology that just came out this summer, and it is a bunch of different authors from all over the world and all sorts of different ethnicities and religions and genders, and they retell known Arthurian stories, so The Lady of Shalott, The Round Table, The Holy Grail, but with twists. So some of them are gender bent, some of them are race bent. For example, The Lady of the Lake here is a albino Ugandan sorceress. The Lady of Shalott is in Mexico City. Excalibur is a baseball bat by a minor league baseball player. So it's really interesting because it takes these myths and it modernizes some of the stories, and without losing what the core of the Arthur story is, I think. There are some aspects that I think can't be changed with any original story, and because of the implications of the importance of gender roles or of assigned behaviors. And I think that playing with gender in this way was really well done, because the whole point of Arthur's story has always been to kind of push against what the expected norms were. Knights experienced very specific emotional scripts that they were expected to follow, and behaviors that they had to do to prove their worthiness as knights. And so you can push back against those anytime you break out of the box of what is expected. And I think that this anthology does a really good job, and including Anthony Rapp, who is an actor. He was in the original Rent production. He's in the new Star Trek Discovery. Ken Liu, who is a Chinese-American author, and a bunch of other authors that I I'm not as familiar with, but now will be reading, because it just kind of expands your boundaries and teaches you more about different styles of writing and different fantasy models that aren't so European, because European history tends to be the overwhelming majority of fantasy. And so I really think that this collection is worth it for anybody to read. Whether you like Arthur or not, they are unique retellings of old stories. Another unique twist is by Polish author, and I think I don't pronounce Polish very well, but the last name is Sapkowski. See? But you may know The Witcher, because that's really popular right now, and season 2 is coming. We just got the promos. I'm very excited. But the books are excellent, and especially book 5 is called The Lady of the Lake, as in the lady who in some Arthurian myths gives Arthur Excalibur. And what happens in this book is Ciri, one of the main characters, ends up kind of being transported into an Arthurian world. And there's like the actual Knights of the Round Table, and it's an interesting twist because it still fits in the world of The Witcher. It is book 5 in the series. I'm not sure how relatable that is without having read the other books. I think if you read the first book, which is just a short story collection, or you've seen the first season, you'd be fine. It might be a little confusing if you don't know anything about the world, but I think it was brilliantly done, and seeing a Polish author write about these stories that are so typically associated with British history was interesting too, what he did with it. So that was very fun for me. One of the books that I read in the course of my program was this book called Once and Future, which is a play on the Once and Future King, a very popular refrain that we get over and over in the Arthur mythos, because the idea is that he will return at a time when Britain needs him the most, because he was carried away when he was mortally wounded by the ladies, and taken to the Isle of Avalon, and like nobody really saw him die or be buried, so that's like the mythology. But what they do with this one is it's space opera, which is a subgenre of science fiction that takes place in space, and it's dramatic and whatever, but it's a female main character who is like the reincarnation of Arthur, and she has to learn how to be Arthur, and it's really cute. Merlin's been around this whole time because he's got magic. There is a sequel now that I'm going to be reading soon, but it's accessible, it's funny, it's interesting, and it, for a teenage girl to be the main character, to be a reincarnation of Arthur, I really enjoyed. Also, a similar writing style, simply because it's written for like a young adult audience, which I do not think lessens the quality of the book at all. That's not what I'm saying, but I mean, it's a word choice and age of characters impacts that kind of genre decision when you're talking about what an audience is. So Kirsten White also wrote typically for young adults, however, it's excellent, and it is called The Glenevere Deception, and it is talking about Glenevere. She was married to a strange man who was a king, who was making an alliance with her father, who was also a king, and she didn't have a choice, and she is villainized in so much of the lore because of her affair with Lancelot, and then her affair with Mordred, and she doesn't have a choice in a lot of steps along the way. And so as modern scholars, and as feminist scholars, and as readers that understand that women in the medieval era didn't always have a choice when it came to marriage, what does that really say about Guinevere? And what is the impact of the choices she made, and how did she really feel about Arthur? She's a side note in a lot of the stories, and even in Mallory that I've been studying, she has dialogue and she has important moments, but they are so few and far between, and it is more to remind the audience that she's having an affair with Lancelot, but we never know what her perspective of that is. If she had a choice, does she love Lancelot? I don't know. So I think as modern readers, that's a really interesting question to grapple with, and what is the importance of her life on the Arthur story. So I enjoyed that. Another feminist retelling of Arthur mythology would be Half Sick of Shadows. This is a fairly new book as well, but it's a retelling of the Lady of Shalott. So she's kind of more feisty, and she does not stay in her castle to watch the Camelot go by. She's from the Isle of Avalon, but she is got the power of prophecy a little bit, and so she wants to change things that she knows are going to be bad, and it's her struggle with knowing what's going to happen and being unable to change certain things. Bernard Cornwell is a historical fiction writer, and he's got a bunch of series, and we have a few of them, and we can get to the others pretty easily. But what he writes about is different aspects of medieval history and making fictional characters fit into realistic worlds. And so even though this isn't specifically Arthur, this particular series, Heretic is the first book, it is about a young knight. He was in King Edward, who was a real man's army, and the 100 Years' War was a very important influence on the Arthur mythos because Thomas Mallory was a knight in the 100 Years' War. But also, he writes a lot of books, and they are ranging from like Norse and Viking. You might know The Lost Kingdom, I think it's called. Let me see here. It's a TV show now that was like a spin-off of Vikings, kind of. But the Warlord Chronicles that start with the Winter King are more specifically about Arthur, and while we don't have copies at Fountaindale, we do have them in the network. But Heretic is a little more of the history, and even though it's still a false man, he's still, there's like the Holy Grail is involved in his story, and the things that his quests that he goes on become very Arthur inspired. And finally, the book I'm reading right now is called The Lost Queen by Signe Pike, and it is a fairly new, it's going to be a trilogy, but the second one just came out, and it's very similar to The Mists of Avalon, which was a 1980s, like, feminist at the time retelling of Avalon and of the magic involved in Arthur's sister, Morgan Le Fay. But what this is about is a 6th century Scottish queen whose twin brother inspired some of the Merlin stories. And so it's her grappling with her religion, which gets called pagan, or, you know, the barbarians or whatever, when the Isles were conquered over and over again by different invaders with different religions. And so the Celtic religions and the pagan religions that she sticks to are starting to die out. And so it's her struggle with her faith and her people, and protecting her people from a world that is changing rapidly, and being married to a Christian king who uses her brother Merlin, which is a Welsh version of Merlin, like what the impact of that is on the changing British Isles, which at the time weren't Britain. They were bunches of different pieces in the 6th century. So it's okay. It's not my favorite because I know too much about Merlin and where his literary history comes from. So I struggle to kind of have that suspension of disbelief about it, because they try to say very hard, no, this is the man that inspired the Merlin myth. But we had Merlin stories in the Welsh predating that era, so I know that that's not the only place that Merlin came from. So I do struggle a little bit with it, but it's still enjoyable, and especially if you are able to kind of just take it as what it is, a fun fantasy novel. It is enjoyable in that way. I think I'm just so involved in my studies that I can't separate it. I have the same problem reading most books lately, where because I'm so used to doing literary analysis, I'm almost never surprised by the ending of a book because I notice what the stereotypical tropes are, or like, oh, we used this word choice, that person's gonna die. Like, it's just funny to me. I hope as I continue moving on in my education that goes away a little bit. But yeah, I hope that these are enjoyable books. I think King Arthur is universal. There's so much that you can do with the world of King Arthur. And I'm about to have my master's degree in Arthurian literature, so if you ever want to talk about Arthur, I am definitely your guy. I specifically know more about the medieval era than the modern or pre-modern, but I know a lot about Arthur. He is my favorite. I have read hundreds of Arthur books. I have watched shows and movies, and we have a bunch of fun movies like Excalibur, which I think was the 80s, 70s, or 80s, and it is excellent, and it is definitely a product of its time, but it is wonderful. We've got that on DVD here. There's the Merlin BBC show that was popular a few years ago. It was kind of cute. There's just so much you can do with Arthur, no matter what genre you like, no matter what medium you like, and no matter which aspect, if you want to talk about crusades or the Holy Grail or knighthood or feminism or what it means to be a woman in the Middle Ages. There's so much you can do. And of course there's magic. And that's what books really are to me, is they've always been magic, and Arthur was my introduction into that, and I wouldn't be in a library without King Arthur, so I really wanted to share that. So thank you for listening, thank you for humoring me, and we will see you around.